This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
I'd like to throw this open to the floor, and of course you're free to ask about whatever you wish to ask about. But what I'd suggest is, there's two obviously interlocking themes here. One is to explore more deeply India's relationship with Sri Lanka, and thus how that influences the practicalities of CHOGM. And then the other is answering Yolanda's challenge, what it is we're actually looking for. What are the benchmarks? What is the progress we're looking for Sri Lanka to make here? Now, I'm going to take questions in groups of three, and if you at the beginning, please make your question a question, not a statement, and please could you give your name and any affiliation you may have before you speak. So I see the woman here is first. Yes, that's you.
I've got a question to both speakers. My name's Tani Malgada, and I've already asked a question. My question to Yolanda is the complaints that you received. Did you receive those complaints before the same complaints were made to the LLRC? And if so, how many were they? And do you now regret, does Amnesty regret that perhaps it didn't engage with the local process? Those are my questions to Yolanda. And to Dr. Venugopal. That was a really interesting analysis of the relationship. My question is this. The TNA really, this is my assessment, they are not a progressive force in terms of sub-regional political progress. The TNA, in my view, do not represent a progressive force in the subcontinent. The politics, and therefore, how do you see India's engagement, this insistence on devolution, in the absence of a progressive political force? How is that going to actually work on the ground? It's all very well saying, historically, that was an important thing. The here and now for Sri Lanka means we need a unitary state, we need a national identity, we need obviously minority rights protected. How do you see the role of the TNA, which has really been redundant in its ethnicity and approach to the political engagement? It's been a reaction to other ethnicity developments. How do you see India actually breaking that link?
Sure. Next question. Anybody? Can we take this person here, I think, is first.
My question for...
so can I have your name and any affiliation you may have?
Yeah, my name is Rajesh from British Numbers World. My question to Yolanda is that, you mentioned about, good account on, good summary on what's happening in Sri Lanka. That Sri Lanka not delivered justice to Tamils or Sri Lankans for the past 60 years. They're engaging, they're talking about engaging constructively for 60 years, not delivered. I'm not talking from 2009, but even before 2009, there were several pogroms against the Tamil community as well as the Tamil Muslim community as well. So the Sri Lanka not going to do any miracle within a year. So where we stand on CHOGM, is it possible to have a venue change? Would other countries support any change? Or would you agree on, we should be lobbying or advocating the leaders, the Commonwealth countries' leaders, to not to attend Sri Lanka? So I would like to have your opinion on one more thing.
Okay.
For Rajesh Venugopal, but you mentioned Tamils as a minority, but the Tamil community, Tamil people in Sri Lanka don't see that as a minority. We usually talk about the Tamil as a nation. We've always been as a nation well before independence. We have a history, we have a language, we have a culture. We qualify to be a nation. Your academic point of view, how would that fit in? The political solution that India or other countries want to have in Sri Lanka. Tamils always say that the international community should recognize the two nations, whether the political solution within United Sri Lanka, then you need to have a complete new constitution to build a good relationship with two nations, rather than talking about minority and majority, which is always playing in upper hand with the single community.
Okay, thank you very much. One more, I believe I saw a hand over there, yes, Pooney. And can we please keep these questions as brief as possible, just so we can get as many people in as possible?
Moving for peace and justice in Sri Lanka.
Yep.
This conflict is an extremely complex conflict.
Okay.
Its geography and its history have made its politics extremely difficult. So, unless people really try to understand this, it may be difficult to resolve it. Just one example. Yes. Okay. Now, to approach this complex conflict, we need to untie a few tangles at a time. For example, CHOGM, not having in Sri Lanka next year, may tell Sri Lankan government something. Another thing, pressing Sri Lankan government to release the 15 reports of the 15 committees he appointed in the last 6 years. That can jerk them out.
Okay, thank you very much. So a couple of questions there. Yolanda, can I go to you first? Complaints, did you receive them before or after the LLRC, and why did Amnesty not engage with the LLRC?
Amnesty did receive a number of complaints before and during the LLRC proceedings, and in fact we made some submissions to the special procedures on that. We actually had very many discussions internally about whether to attend the LLRC or not, involving our senior legal team at Amnesty. And our discussion centred around a number of important themes. First of all, we had to tackle a challenge that we had been sent by victims' families. We actually received an appeal from some of the victims' families who were disappointed at the Commission of Inquiry report in 2007. For people who don't know about that, this was a commission of inquiry set up in 2006 to tackle a number of egregious human rights violations, including the massacre of the ACF workers and the killing of Dreamco students in the east coast of Sri Lanka in January 2006. Some of those families contacted us and said, the commission of inquiry was set up by the President only because the international community at that time was threatening to increase the presence of the Office of the High Commissioner in the country. That commission was an eyewash. How can Amnesty support the LLRC if some of the key issues that had emerged from that commission of inquiry remain unchanged? They pointed to lack of witness protection. If you remember, there was a lot of debate around the video conferencing in the COIA, reprisals to victims afterwards. So we had several series of meetings, and we also had to look at Amnesty's policies around commissions. So we made our decision based on our ethical commitment to what are the principles that a commission of inquiry must uphold in order to be robust enough for victims' families. And those standards include a credible witness protection programme. So before making our decision, we wrote to the government of Sri Lanka, and in fact we issued that letter publicly with Crisis Group, International Crisis Group and Human Rights Watch. And it was actually an appeal to the government of Sri Lanka to say, it's important that a commission such as this is set up, but in order to be a credible commission, it must do the following steps, including implementing this draft bill on witness and victim protection that I've heard in the air for 7 years now. The government never responded to that. So Amnesty decided that as victims did not have confidence in the process, it was important to highlight the lack of credible domestic mechanisms and explain that, which we did. We did send a submission to the Commission, so we participated from a distance. We sent a submission to the LLRC, which involved cases of abuses by the Tamil Tigers, including child recruitment cases. And we submitted some of the cases that had been sent to us from families. So actually we did sort of participate by distance. However, we maintained a very firm public line that this is not an independent, credible commission. Someone else asked me about position on CHOGM.
Yeah, take that now.
Right. It's really difficult, I think, for me to answer this question. I think that whether Sri Lanka should be hosting CHOGM is really a question that Commonwealth states should answer. Commonwealth states have to look in the mirror and ask themselves, do we stand by the Harare Declaration? Do we stand by the values that we have set out in the communique of 2011? And if Sri Lanka falls short of those, then it's up to Commonwealth states themselves to draw a conclusion about whether this is going to be a credible location to have an event. From Amnesty's perspective, what we want to see, I mean, it's an incredibly difficult position. Globally, our position is that it's very hard for victims' families domestically to have a glimmer of hope that there will be change in the near future. And that is why we're asking the United Nations and other UN member states to support an international commission of inquiry in Sri Lanka, because there really are no credible domestic mechanisms. Having said that, the reality is that this event has been scheduled for October 2013. So at a minimum, we are insisting that Commonwealth states must support and push for a number of actionable benchmarks that can be achieved. Of course, I mean, Rajesh has highlighted, this meeting is happening in an interesting year. So a landmark resolution, Resolution L192, was passed in March this year, which puts a responsibility on members of the Human Rights Council to look at whether or not the government has implemented the LLRC recommendations. And that resolution is admittedly far too weak for human rights organisations because it doesn't adequately address the violations of international law. Having said that, it has laid out a clear framework for UN Human Rights Council states to monitor progress. So I think from a sort of advocacy viewpoint, from the viewpoint of victims' families, looking at how the world is reacting in the next year, we've had the UPR event, we've taken stock of that. Amnesty is likely to issue something about the progress on that in the next couple of weeks, or lack of progress, I should say. But what we're looking at, really, I think a lot of attention will be focused on March Human Rights Council session 2013, and looking at what is the rhetoric and the reality of what the government will be presenting in that session. How are the Human Rights Council states who did vote? I mean, it was very fascinating to see such a diverse range of countries, you know, many African countries, Latin countries, extraordinary India for its own interesting reasons supporting that resolution. So there is a groundswell of interest at the Human Rights Council, and I think that will be the moment, that will be a litmus test, really. And I think for many people, it will be very interesting to see the dynamics of that council session, and really that will set a clock ticking, because then it will be 6 months to CHOGM. And if there's been a failure to deliver in March, then I think the pressure must ramp up since then.
Thank you, and I think that also touches on the other question, because these 15 presidential reports, they could be the kind of criteria that's placed there. Rajesh, you had two questions. One is, are the TNA a useful interlocutor between India and Sri Lanka, given that it was suggested they're not a progressive organisation? And the other one was about how do you deal with the fact that Tamils see themselves not as a minority, but as a nation?
Okay, thank you. I actually am going to try to answer both of those questions in one, because my answer is fairly similar. Whether the TNA is progressive or not, whether Tamils view themselves as a nation or not, does not have a huge amount of significance to India's position vis-a-vis either. So I'm not going to, I mean, I have my own opinion on both of those issues, but that's really neither here nor there. The first thing I wanted to touch upon in terms of the TNA is whether the TNA is judged by anybody to be a progressive force or not. the DNA is a factor. And I think it is a mistake of anybody, whether it be India or the Sri Lankan government, to ignore an important factor on the ground. So I actually want to sort of leave it at that. The DNA has, whether you like it or not, been elected to certain positions of authority, representation. Now, one has to take seriously the fact that most of the vote of Sri Lankan Tamils has gone towards the DNA. So whether or not they're progressive is, I think, not going to make a difference as to whether we have to deal with them or not. DNA is there. In fact, all kinds of things might change. For example, the census is going to change the electoral rolls pretty soon. The representation of Sri Lankan Tamils in the next Sri Lankan Parliament is going to come down. In contrast, what you might well find, and I think something is coming up as we speak, the influence of the upcountry Tamils is actually going to be more than the northeastern Tamils, because we're probably going to find out pretty soon that there are more upcountry Tamils in Sri Lanka than northeastern Tamils. People like Manu Ganeshan may be a more important person in terms of who he represents than someone like that is besides the point. So what I'm just saying is that whether or not they're progressive, one has to recognize the fact that they have been elected and one has to deal with them. The second issue is, I think, it's also not necessarily going to change India's position one way or another vis-a-vis Sri Lanka, its engagement in Sri Lanka, how they view the Sri Lankan Tamils' self-recognition and perception. India is going to engage, not again, I use the term minority because it is more of a demographic statement than anything else. But I think India's engagement with the Sri Lankan Tamil community has not changed. I mean, what is incredible about so many things about the Sri Lankan ethnic conflict is how little has changed over decades. Some of the basic structural parameters have just not changed year and after year. You could have picked up the paper and heard something that the TNA said today. You could have picked up something and heard what the TOLF said 30 years ago. You'd be shocked how similar those things are, or 50 years ago. Often the children of the same people, sons and daughters, saying roughly the same thing. And on the other side as well, what Sri Lankan government or even single nationalist advocates might be talking about. So I think that the position that India is going to take vis-a-vis the Sri Lankan Tamil population is not going to change, because they do have relatively fixed conceptions which are based on Indian conceptions of what is appropriate and what is not appropriate. Because India's involvement in Sri Lanka has to do with India's interests and India's concerns rather than anything else. India has, as I said earlier, a paternalistic concern for a community, and they have a certain sense of action that they're going to take. I don't think that they're going to view the Sri Lankan Tamil, that the fact that they view it is necessarily going to change anything. Also because India does not view its own internal domestic components as nations, although the categories and the compulsions for nationality are of anything much greater in India for many of the different component groups than they are in Sri Lanka.
Thank you. I'm going to try and take 2 rounds of questions, but in order to do that, both the questions and the answers are going to have to be brief. So the man in front's been waiting patiently for a while. Then I see someone here, and then someone here I think was next. So if you go first.
I understand Ms. Yolanda Foster is from the Amnesty International. Is it not hypocritical of Amnesty International not to have conducted the campaign against the Olympics being held in Britain, given the role Britain played in attack on Iraq based on weapons of mass destruction? Are you being fair to poor country? I mean, poor countries have to take various bits of advice from every rich man who comes to the question. Is it fair? Second question, Dr. Rajesh, is it not the case that India in the past, in the 70s, armed the terrorist group who no doubt had some reason to be not getting university entrance because of various reasons government wanted to give more options to village, rural youth who were unemployed at the time. Is it not fair? Is it, can India expect, can Sri Lanka expect India to be fair advocates? And historically, Sri Lanka's plantation economy born out of, in China, at the time of opium wars. Opium was grown in India, sold in China, it became uneconomic, and then Sri Lanka became the degrowing countries.
Okay, we got the question.
Now from the town square. To pick up on what you said about the reason why India was in favour of the resolution in March. I'm one of the members of the British Council, represents the British Council in Geneva. I've been working there regularly, and what we saw was that the Indian mission there, they were not in favour of the resolution. In fact, even after Manmohan Singh, the second Parliament left, they were inclined to vote in favour of that. But the things like the mission was going around and saying that they were against. So I'd like to have your feedback on that.
Okay, and then the guy in the white shirt,
So my name is Jim Kosker, I'm a full-time human rights lawyer, London. I'm also working with Praise in the Sri Lanka campaign for Project Do Just Now. And I was wondering, heard about how the pressures of the Commonwealth and pressures of individual state like India can try and bring about what can affect Sri Lanka. I was wondering, do you think it's best for a group of states like the Commonwealth to affect Sri Lanka's move towards accountability, or is it better for individual states to, like India, like India's methods to pressure Sri Lanka into accountability?
Thank you. Well, we can ask that of both panelists. So Yolanda, you were asked about obviously Amnesty not campaigning against events being held in the UK. Just to clarify, I don't think you did say that Amnesty were...
It's extremely important that Amnesty raise human rights issues in the UK. In fact, in the middle of last month, we issued an enormous report on secret control orders in the United Kingdom, which you can read on our website. So, I mean, the reason why you might see me often in these forums speaking about South Asia is because the way that we work at Amnesty is in regional programs. So I work in the Asia program, and my specialty is Sri Lanka and Nepal. So that if you go to our website, you'll find a huge amount of material on the UK and the US. I believe probably Amnesty has probably published more on the US-led war on terror than anything else. So do go to our website.
Sure, okay. And then you had a question about India's historical role arming the LTT and also the demonstrations outside of the Human Rights Council.
Yes, India did not just arm the LTT. India, every one of the Tamil militant groups in the 1980s, not in the 70s, from 1983 to 1986, roughly. So that is sort of a historical fact. It's been borne out by many of the people that were trained themselves.
Had special camps and Tamil Nadu had special camps.
And then set up camps. The Indian security forces set up camps.
83 to 86, you're right.
Fantastic, okay.
So that was question one. Question two, thank you for that insight. It's really very interesting. And I think what it signifies is that the decision of India to vote against Sri Lanka in March came from the very top. It did not, it was, first of all, it reflects ambivalence all across the Indian structure, the decision-making structure and the bureaucracy. And secondly, it reflects the fact that the decision came from the very top. It was communicated to the mission relatively late.
Brilliant. I don't think anyone's addressed, so I really want to have a go at whether it's more effective for states collectively through multinational forums such as the Commonwealth to influence Sri Lanka, or whether it's more powerful for bilateral India to Sri Lanka, China to Sri Lanka, whatever they be relationships to engage.
It's a really tough question. I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer that, but I don't know, I have to think a lot about it before I can give you a more reasonable response.
It's a very good question because you've stopped the panel. Right, we're going to have one last round of questions. So that man there had his hand up, and then that man there, and then that man there. So go first.
Okay, thanks. You mentioned, I think you mentioned, but I know this anyway, the Convention Against Torture Sri Lanka has signed up to that. Just so briefly to Yolanda, the question is, apparently in the last UPR 4 years ago, they entered into a lot of commitments, to be fair, on the Convention Against Torture. Was that discussed in this latest UPR that come up? That's my question. And following on from the question before, so maybe you won't be able to answer it. But if we envisage a situation where the Sri Lanka fails on the next March and the process, and there's pressure on the Commonwealth to boycott the event, do you think India will feel obliged to take a lead in that boycott, in your opinion?
Sure. Okay, now this one here.
William Cromwell, Institute of Commonwealth Studies. Question for Dr. Venugopal. In talking about India's policy towards Sri Lanka, it obviously has its own history, its own dynamic. But would you agree that, as regards China's influence in the Indian Ocean, that there's a lot of similarity between the step change that's happened in Indian policy in Myanmar and in relation to Sri Lanka? That is, that India has decided we can't afford to be driven by human rights issues, human rights concerns, however much the international concern is. We must take into account India's economic interests and the strategic threats that India perceives towards it.
Okay, and finally up at the front.
Yes, David Page. I just wondered if you felt, Dr. Venugopal, that the decision by India to vote as it did on the human rights issue is a sign that it is actually losing influence in Yolanda. I just wondered if you would reflect on what is the leverage that India has in Colombo now, and if there are any instances in which it's actually used it effectively.
Okay, thank you very much. Three very good questions. First of all, I think I can answer one of the questions in the Universal Periodic Review. And it's interesting, this is the first time that a Universal Periodic Review has gone full cycle. So we're only now beginning to learn how Universal Periodic Review processes assess previous Universal Periodic Review processes. And what it turns out is they don't anywhere near the amount that they should. And to a certain extent, after UPR cycle has gone full circle, it's kind of ignored. And to combat that, we did a report. And we looked at what the government of Sri Lanka said. And I don't have the exact figures, but it was on our website. And they said something like, of about 70 recommendations they accepted, they completed 12. And then they just said progress on the rest was ongoing, which was beautifully nebulous. We did our own kind of assessment, and we felt they'd completed 4, and that they'd maybe done a little bit about 15, and that the rest they'd done virtually nothing. So I think I can help you there. But Yolanda may have something to add, and also on the ratifying of the CAT.
Just, I'm really pleased you mentioned torture, because I think that whole area illustrates Sri Lanka's failure to actually engage with special procedures. Sri Lanka went through the Committee Against Torture review in November 2011. There's actually a standard procedural obligation on a state to give a 1-year update in response to some of the questions raised by CAT. They failed to do that. So that's just one example of ongoing failure. And it was really interesting because obviously torture was raised by a member of states in the UPR review, and some states specifically encouraged Sri Lanka to ratify the optional protocol to the UN Convention on Torture, which was a recommendation that was rejected.
Thank you very much. So Dr. Venugopal, we have 3 questions. One is, would India lead if a sort of robust stance was taken towards CHOGM? One was, is this marking a step change based upon India's economic interests? And the third was, does it mark the fact that India is losing its grip on Colombo?
Okay, first question, will India lead a boycott of CHOGM? At present, I can't see that happening. I think it would be unprecedented overreach. It may be too aggressive for the people in Delhi. It would be a step too far. So my guess is that it is unlikely that India will lead a boycott. It would be very embarrassing, in fact, if India were forced to be in a position to have to decide whether to boycott or not. Unless India's relationship with Sri Lanka were deteriorated precipitously in the next few months, to the point where India felt that there was a need to make a demonstratively punitive public course of action. It's not how Indian diplomacy works. I really don't like doing that kind of stuff. If this was sort of South Africa in the 80s, maybe, but it's not close to that. So I think what you would find is they would be very ambivalent and be very unhappy to be put in the position of having to decide. And I think they would probably lobby behind the scenes to stop any such boycott.
Yeah.
Okay, or just have a space-saving way in which it did not have to be taken up.
Because we're out of time, quickly on the second and third.
Myanmar, I think you're right. I think there's also a lot of ambivalence on Myanmar vis-a-vis India's position. So, for example, Aung San Suu Kyi was in India a few days ago, and she was welcomed widely. She, went to school in India. She has many friends there, and India's position vis-a-vis China was criticized for being China India. There was a big debate, but the Indian government went along and was generally more conciliatory towards Myanmar. That said, they're very happy that they don't have to make that choice quite the same degree of sharpness now. So they are happy to follow the international trend towards cautiously re-embracing them. The third thing is what was Geneva? I think Geneva was, to put it very bluntly, a sign of telling Colombo to go to hell. They were very, very irritated. If you talk to people in Delhi, not just in the government and various circles, they are incredibly frustrated. They have never ever had to deal with anybody like the present Sri Lankan government, because they assume in all their arrogance that they are a big, big power and Sri Lanka is a tiny, tiny country and they're going to do what they're told and shut up and do it. So they're not doing it. So that is, you want to be critical of the Indian arrogance here, and I think Sri Lankans are often very accurate in caricaturing how Indians talk to them. And they do. You should see how people in Delhi come when they land up in Colombo. So I think it was effectively a sign of saying, you played us off against China a little bit too much. This is not domestic politics of UNP versus SLFP. Don't treat us like that. If you want China, you can have China. There you are. I think that's actually the attitude. There's a hardened attitude, there's real irritation in New Delhi. There is also real irritation in Colombo as a result. So Colombo has basically been closing a few doors in India since March. And there is real acrimony there of a kind that I haven't seen for, what hasn't witnessed for a long time. So I think they are losing it.
And thank you both to the panel very, very much. And these are back-to-back sessions, so we're going to vacate now, and I think the next people are coming straight up. So thank you to the panel.